right. So first of all, thanks so much for inviting me. When Reverend Starsky called me with this invitation, I knew that this was the right place to have a discussion on democracy because throughout my life, I've been involved in some campaigns. I worked on President Obama's 2008 campaign, but I never experienced democracy in its purest form until Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson. And in the following months, we saw city council meetings flooded with participants, county council meetings where people were live streaming the meetings. Sometimes they shut down those meetings. Sometimes they protested in front of those meetings. Sometimes people testified in ways that brought the audience to tears. To me, when I used to be involved in those protests and people would ask the question, tell me what democracy looks like, there would be a response, this is what democracy looks like. And so the discussion around democracy with any organization that is interested in promoting it, I believe, has to involve a reflection on what happened here in 2014 and in the following months. So if we are going to respond to the question today, how do we make sure democracy stays alive in 2020? I believe that we have to have a clear understanding that in the same way that it took a crisis in 2014 for our democracy in this region to be reinvigorated, you could say in 2020 what Ferguson was to this region, the election of President Trump has been for the nation, and we can expect this crisis to result in perhaps a similar need for a radical response. So to respond to these 4 excellent points that were made, and I'm going to also keep it brief. I think like there's 7 minutes left for me. I want to talk about the reflections that we could, should, and will be able to provide as people who lived through the Ferguson moment here in this region that could be an asset for the entire nation in 2020. On the question of how do you respond to a surge in citizen involvement, I think we have to ask ourselves, how did we respond to the surge in citizen involvement in the aftermath of Ferguson? In those city council meetings, there clearly were some city council members who were not necessarily prepared for people to rush the doors seeking to get into their meeting, for people to provide long speeches during their testimony. So when the structures of democracy are not prepared for democratic participation, that will cause a number of problems. Number one, it will cause frustration in the citizenry because they believe that this is what you're here for. When I come and I testify at your city council meeting, and when we have a Ferguson Commission convened, I expect this structure to be responsive to me and all of my messiness, my emotions, my desire for justice, my frustration, my community's outrage. And let's be clear, right now in our nation, there is much reason for outrage. And in 2020, depending how things transpire, there could be much reason for outrage. So how will our structures respond to the citizens who demand some sort of responsiveness? In Ferguson, we saw that civic engagement reached perhaps its zenith in the region. It was a level of participation that we had never seen before from our youth, from communities of color, and we saw that that participation was not always welcomed by the government outside of the elected officials. We also have to look at the police department. There were many incidences where people who sought to participate in democracy through protests, and I definitely want to remind folks that protest is a type of democratic participation, particularly for those who do not have the resources for more formal types of participation in the electoral process. And when people took to the streets, we saw that there was often a negative reaction. It's not surprising when government entities react negatively to being criticized. Oftentimes when young people and communities of color participate, you may not like what they have to say because they may be brutally honest, and they may be speaking a truth that people may not be prepared to hear. So we saw that it took litigation by groups like the ACLU, the Arch City Defenders, to ensure that the people's voice was heard during those times. Of course, we know that the efforts to stifle participation were not equal. They were not bipartisan. There were groups such as the Oath Keepers that were freely able to engage in their First Amendment rights and their Second Amendment rights in the streets during that time period without interference. And the lesson from that, I believe, is that we have to be able to distinguish bipartisanship with neutrality. What do I mean by that? I mean that for many of our organizations that are charged to avoid partisanship, whether because of their tax-exempt status or for other reasons, we cannot take the stance that that means that the organizations must be neutral, when we are clear that there are some communities that are going to be targeted in a much more harsh way than others. So that would be a second lesson to take away from the Ferguson moment. It was predictable that some people would face more interference in their efforts to engage in our democracy, in their efforts to make their voice heard and participate politically than others. So we can anticipate that this will happen again in 2020. Finally, on the question of misinformation, we also saw that take place in the aftermath of Ferguson. Fox News claimed that there were protesters being employed by George Soros, paid to protest. I know for one, I'm still waiting for my check to clear from George Soros. But I didn't know any paid protesters in Ferguson, and I think it's been pretty clearly documented that the protesters took a great deal of risk on themselves with no pay in order to make their voices heard. But it's a reminder that it's not only Russian bots that we should be concerned about when it comes to misinformation. Misinformation can take place in mainstream media. It can take place in local news. There was a study in 2016 in the Wisconsin Law Review that found that both before and after the Ferguson moment, local reporters overwhelmingly played to the politics of respectability, in that they researched extensively into the backgrounds of the victims of the officer-involved shootings. Local reporters often took the perspective that the police scanner was their first and last source of information. In other words, they saw that as the source of truth, and very rarely provided both sides of an incident. So the way to support free flows of information is not simply the creation of more information. In other words, not simply the creation of more news or more reporting, but we must also invest in the quality of the news, in the quality of the reporting, whether that involves education for journalists, whether it involves other mechanisms for ensuring that multiple viewpoints are heard on these controversial issues. We have to find a way to improve quality, not just quantity. So in conclusion, I just want to thank you all for coming out for this important discussion. I do believe that Ferguson should be our jumping off point. As uncomfortable of a moment as it was in 2014 for us here in the region, it's going to be a very uncomfortable moment in 2020 for the nation as these issues get played out through the election cycle and beyond. Our politics are so much more than elections. Between election years, the stakes continue to be so high for so many people. But the way our system is structured, it is this small window right before an election where people really have an opportunity to make their voice heard on these questions that affect their lives so centrally. And we should expect there to be an outpouring of emotion, and hopefully we can find a way to respond to it in a way that ensures the dignity and the respect that our community deserves. Thanks so much.
So we are grateful for both Joe and Justin giving us a lot to think about. We want to structure the next part of our dialogue as indeed that, making some time for reflection, for collective discussion, including Q&A, but then also some action planning and maybe smaller conversations. So we'll try to move in that way. Does that make sense, everybody? So first, we've been talking at you. So what we want to give is you just a couple of moments to sit with what you've heard and to reflect, maybe even jot some notes for yourself on this question. What did you hear that stirred tension, inspiration, or further questions for you? What did you hear that stirred tension, inspiration, or further questions? There'll be no Jeopardy music, but we'll give you a few minutes just to maybe jot on that, to process a little bit. So I want to ask our staff team, so we've got another mic to float around. I want to ask folks who are willing to share perhaps what you heard that generated for you tension, inspiration, or further questions. And we'll ask folks, Becky, you got something right up front. So let's just lift where some tensions are and where some inspiration is.
I'm Becky Hatter. I'm the CEO of Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Eastern Missouri. Three things jumped off the page: an engaged electorate. I'm wondering, are our little brothers and little sisters both active and alumni? Are they registered to vote? I'm also wondering, should I allow my staff that may want to work at the polls paid time off and allow them to be trained? And the last one was just an amazing understanding now of the difference between bipartisanship and neutrality.
Great, great. Other reactions, tensions, inspiration. It's an active section over here.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Singer. I'm on the board of Show Me Integrity. So there was a point of tension, Mr. Goldman, from something you said, and I think, Mr. Hansford, you spoke to, which is kind of that this is a longstanding problem. We talk about the, a crisis in our democracy, but, and there was something in your article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy about making our electorate more representative, and in the report that you all commissioned about elite capture, and kind of squaring the fact that for a long time, right, even if our electorate is representative, the studies show there's a statistically insignificant effect between public opinion and the actual policies that Congress passes, because the powerful moneyed interests are the ones driving policy. and the fact that even if our electorate is more representative, that those who are funding our elections and the campaigns of our officials are as unrepresentative as possible. And the idea of, addressing that with fundamental reform of how money works in our elections. And I didn't see that in the report, that was commissioned. So that's a big tension I'm sitting with.
Yeah. We'll lift some of these. We're going to come back to them, though. So yes, we got Daryl over here. Come back to you. I just want to give this room a shot. This side.
Over here on the groom side, yeah. So I'm Daryl Collins. I interjected myself earlier. Thank you, Starsky. I work for Commerce Bank, and I'm a former board member. I was concerned when, Joe, you mentioned the strain you expect on the capacity of the system just in carrying out the process. And what really gives me a lot of tension is that I don't know that we have the ability to ensure agreement in the outcome because of the things, not only the capacity of the system will be questioned potentially, but obviously the interference that's occurred in the past. So even if we, again, if things are closed, then there'll be the same sort of hues and cries on either side that say, well, this was tainted and this wasn't real. And so I'm afraid, I'm curious what we can do in advance to assure that the results will be considered fair.
Great. Maybe two more, then we'll get some reactions here.
Morning, my name's Richard Von Glahn. I'm the policy director at Missouri Jobs with Justice, and we often do issue advocacy work, and we are abundantly clear, and I agree with you strongly, Justin, that issue work is fundamentally nonpartisan, but often the response to issue advocacy work is sort of predictably partisan, and I think that often clouds the judgment of funders or nonprofits to say, we have to sit on the sideline because the response to this is going to be partisan, but the actual work is not. And so I'm curious if you have advice about how we break that down and bring that clarity to the work.
Great. Let's get Jess in, and then we'll get some reactions.
I was actually, mine's very similar to what Richard just said. So
Okay, all right.
You can pick someone else. I can
All right.
Hello, my name is DeMarco Davidson, and the voter program lead for Metropolitan Congregations United, also known as MCU. Justin, welcome back. We miss you. Definitely some tension around stating that the murder of Mike Brown should be a starting point for many positive reasons. I agree with you, but then also recognizing that the gerrymandering and so many other aspects of the election of Obama or the outcry from that that started in 2010 would like to engage more in the discussion on how much of an impact that had, and if whether Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and Black Lives Matter became a hashtags or not, the chances of the outcome still would have been similar. So what can we do, still being in a not neutral, but in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way?
Great. Thanks, DeMarco. So give Joe and Justin, so you see what's being felt in the room. You have a sense of some tension and some questions. What might be some reactions there? I want to, as we do that, I want to do something so I don't forget it. On your seats, as they prepare to react and respond to all the things that you put forward or what you're feeling, on your seats you got a copy of the October issue of the Chronicle of Philanthropy that raised this question of can philanthropy save democracy? And ahead of time you got Joe's op-ed on some of these issues, framing some of these. Here, there's more delving into what philanthropy is doing. One of the things I just like in the context of this conversation and connect with Joe's comments is that if we define philanthropy as grant making, then the answer is no. If we define philanthropy more broadly in the sense of its etymological origins as love of humanity and those who are doing work to love humanity and care for people, those in the social sector and in government, largely like those in this room, then I think there's much that we can do, right? And so just want to appreciate that part of what you'll get there as you take that away is some guidance and connection in that way, and some limitation that it's a little too grant makery. If that's a word. It will be later. That'll be a word later, grant makery. But in that sense, as people are having, I hear in the questions a sense of call, a sense of tension about what you've shared, that this should be a broader definition of philanthropy that includes everyone in this room. How do you react and respond to what has created tension, inspiration, or questions for folks that are here gathered?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things come to mind. And first, just so what creates the question: can philanthropy save democracy? Creates tension for me. To be real, philanthropy is part of the problem, right? The wealth behind philanthropy has created some of the problems, right? And by definition, a political system that is driven by the interests and influence of wealth is not a democracy, right? That's a plutocracy, right? There is obvious tension there, and I think it's also worrying to me to ever use a term like "save democracy." Like it makes it seem like there was some golden age where democracy worked, right? It was like we were of, by, and for the people. We have strayed from it, and so how do we save it and get back to where we were? And that doesn't make sense. Democracy is this kind of constant struggle in which we're trying to balance these different values, and as one part of it gets better, another part gets worse, and it kind of requires this constant vigilance by all of us. And it's never going to be kind of one. I love that Margaret Mead quote of, right, all it takes is a small group of thoughtful, committed people to save the world. Yeah, and we all got to be part of the process, right? We all got to be part of the solution. And I think there is a role for philanthropy to play, but that is, more than anything else, to be an ally to others to make things work better, right? So I guess the two things that kind of came up from the floor that I would say a couple words about. So one is this kind of tension about elite capture and the degree to which the system has been profoundly unjust, and the degree to which just turning out is not going to necessarily produce just outcomes, right? That is decidedly the case. And we have to turn out, right? So these things are both true. And I guess I would somewhat quibble with the notion that there is a time in the past where we've had highly representative participation, right? It has tended to be the case that significant communities are not represented, and that is because the system is rigged in different kinds of ways, right? So part of how you solve that is by getting the participation more representative in order to put more pressure on the system to be responsive, and you need reforms that further create a more inclusive and just democracy, right? I think these things are all true, but what I worry about is a sense that the system's rigged, it's fixed, we can't do anything about it, why bother voting, right? That's not the outcome that we want. And so relatedly, I guess the concern that was raised about what can we do to make sure that we can trust the results of our elections, right? And this is something that we've spent a fair amount of time working on at the Democracy Fund. We've done a lot of kind of public opinion research to understand kind of what messages help people kind of balance this. Like, it doesn't make sense that we should be blindly trusting of the results of our elections, right? That's not good. It is healthy to have some level of skepticism because we want to make sure it works, and we have lots of evidence in the past of it not working, right? But we also need to make sure that people believe enough in the system to turn out. So, for us, that has been investing in things like risk limiting audits, right? It's a practice using statistical methods so after an election, you can actually look at kind of the character of turnout, look at the numbers, and understand if something fishy was going on, right? There should be elections there should be audits after an election. There should be best practices put in place for how we think about the machines that we're using for elections. Those are things that kind of the public needs to be an active and vibrant conversation with our election officials about, such that we can kind of go into an election understanding where there may be legitimate vulnerabilities, but what we're doing to mitigate against them, and what we're doing such that after an election we can have faith and trust in the outcome, right? And it's a hard, like, our election officials do really hard work, right? It's one of these things where, like, there are not many things in our society that we go from essentially zero across the year to all of a sudden everyone turning up on one single day, right? That puts a lot of pressure on a system, as I'm sure Robin and others in this room can testify to. And I think we need to figure out how we can pay attention to our systems of election administration at times that it's not just after a crisis that we pay attention. It's not just after we saw the hanging chads that we say, oh, hey, we should pay attention to ballot design, right? We, as a kind of civic community, need to go into an election having paid attention to the systems that we have in place and partner with election officials to make sure that the process works. Where do you want to go?
Thanks. Well, so many things in my mind. Well, I first want to speak to this idea around nonpartisanship versus neutrality. There's a quote from Noam Chomsky which said that you can't be neutral on a moving train. And I think that people who are involved in this work have to remember that their work should be, and I believe usually is, grounded in values. And those values are nonpartisan. And when you have enough of a understanding of your values, whether that value is transparency or egalitarianism, you can protect those values and you can defend those values from arguments that you're being in some way partisan because you're fighting for election integrity and this leads you to oppose voter suppression. And you know, voter suppression may help one party as opposed to the other party, but you are adhering to your values, and that's legitimate. And that's part of your mission as an organization to do so. And you may have to articulate those values more clearly to defend yourself against attacks that assume that you're being partisan. But ultimately, I think you'll be glad that you've articulated your values more clearly. It'll help you in the long run. So that was my initial thought in response to that question. Boy, there's so many different things. I do believe that we are going to see people enthusiastic about participating. There is this idea of people needing to have a certain level of belief in order to take the risk of putting their voices out there and putting themselves out there. I think one of the reasons we've had such low levels of participation in elections in the past, compared to other countries, I think our normal turnout rate is under 60% or 65% as a country. Other countries are in the 80 and 90 percentile. There is a lack of belief in the system. Oftentimes that lack of belief is justified based on the history. That's why the idea that America as a nation, as a structure, had a past that was, full of democratic.
Great.
Yeah, another greatness, right? In that we will obtain that greatness again. That's a polarizing. There's Kayla Reed, one of our great advocates for democracy here, walking in. But that is a divisive statement because people who understand history know that our system has never created an environment which allowed for people like myself to believe in it in the first place. as people who want to create a system like that, we have to start to be creative and think about what new structures could encourage people to participate. One interesting thing that happened during the Obama administration, they had a process through which if there was some sort of question or initiative that somebody had and they created an online campaign and got 100,000 people to sign on to this, I think it was actually through the White House, change.gov, right? So if you had a certain number of people sign on to a particular question or issue, the White House would actually respond to that. That is a innovative structural change, a mechanism for democratic participation. Change in administration, I believe that process was destroyed or eliminated when the new administration came in. But that's the type of thing that can be something that promotes democracy. It can be a structure. It can be something, there can be things in the system that can promote participation. We should try to promote those types of structures in the future. Last point, responding to DeMarco on I believe your question was around this idea that Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown's killings were responded to primarily because President Obama was in office. Is that's the way I was understanding your statement, in the sense that people felt like that their participation would be welcomed during those years because they felt like there was a structure that would listen to them. That's not, okay, that's what well, what I will say on those points though, I do believe that there is something to that notion that people have to be encouraged to participate. You have the Kayla Reeds of the world who have strong voices already, but when you're talking about getting hundreds and thousands of people to participate who normally don't participate, they do need encouragement. The encouragement has to come from people who are in places of power in society. If that's not coming from the government, then other powerful sources of resources like philanthropy, the civic sector, these other sectors need to be the ones sending that message. In the same way that I do actually agree with the perspective that President Obama's presence in some way encouraged people to speak out on those issues. I'm hoping that these other sectors can create a presence that can encourage people to speak out in 2020.
So I want to do something that I want to do every now and again, which puts some people on the spot. We have heard, so I'll say that I didn't do this alone. Joe did it. So blame Joe for the people I'm about to put on the spot. As he noted, these bellwether institutions that help democracies in crisis or lead to promise for return, more significant there that he lands with among the independent civil service and the independent judiciary and the courts is robust civil society and the free press. We happen to have in the room a couple of things that become pillars for this conversation. We've got a couple of members of the press, Amy Shaw from 9 Network, and sitting just across from her, Chris King from the St. Louis American. So I wanted to take an opportunity to get their reaction. As they react and perhaps respond, and maybe I'm inviting Chris into a story that he's writing, so he's going to violate all kind of journalistic principles and rules here. We're also graced to have in the room 2 people who have actually run elections and been responsible for them in our community. One in the person of Rita Hurd Days, who's now in the St. Louis County Council, but also spent some time in the St. Louis County Board of Election Commissioners, and Robin Carnahan, who served as our chief kind of elections officer here in the state. So I wanted to just spend a round hearing from these folks who have in this community had responsibility for and seen the challenges with press, the freedom of the press, and the opportunity for the press to engage in educating the public, to have an engaged citizenry in the interest of democracy, and folks who have had responsibility for the administration of elections to talk about what that has looked like in our community and perhaps where we've got some room to grow and to work. Is that okay? Ain't nobody mad at me? I'm a hide behind Joe.
I'm not going to say
All right. Good deal. All right. So we'll start over here.
I'll go. I'm Amy Shaw. Up until 7 months ago, I was the Senior Vice President and Chief Content Officer, so my decisions were squarely focused on content creation, and now I'm the interim president and CEO, so I'm doing both jobs at the moment, which is an interesting dynamic to think about our fidelity to key issues in our community, but also to think then about the enterprise as a whole, and actually it makes it a little bit easier on some level. So I think our equity is trust, and so how do we think about telling stories that are based in trust? And if we do anything that erodes that equity of trust, then it impedes our ability to have any kind of meaningful communication with our community. So as long as it's true and it's just, we want to have those conversations, but also think of it as a steady drumbeat of conversations. We don't do news, so I'm very grateful that we don't do news because I don't have the decision to make of, I'll throw racial equity out there as an example of thinking about racial equity and creating content about racial equity, and then on the news every night doing something that absolutely walks that back on a daily basis. So we don't have to do that. But I think it's about using the people in our organization to ensure that we're on the ground doing the right work, talking to the right people, and thinking about how that impacts the larger community as a whole. So our language is about creating the kinds of conversations that at scale create change in our community or help people talk about those issues. And so if we can get the majority community to start thinking about, wow, I really do have a role and hope. I mean, this whole idea of sadness and hope, I'm sitting here thinking the same thing about our democracy. I'm not terribly hopeful at the moment. I feel very sad about having watched the hearings from my office last week, which we made the decision to preempt children's programming so that we would have the hearings on in an unbiased way without, the little tags on the bottom that gave some sort of which was a really hard decision because children are everything to us, but we really felt the need to make sure that people had the ability to watch this in an unfettered way and to make sure that we were having the right kind of news coverage for that. So those are the decisions on a daily basis. But how do we help the larger community become involved in those conversations and see hope that their voices do actually make a difference on a daily basis? And also have them realize that just because maybe the way they see it is not the same way as maybe someone else sees it, that doesn't mean it's not true. So your words about dignity and respect, how do we have those kinds of conversations across the community? So I'm sitting here thinking about, as we move into the election season, that's one way to think about it. Yes, election time is important, but the longer thread of that. So what do we do for elections that are different demonstrably to have conversations that give people hope in the democratic process simply because they're involved in it? I don't have answers, but just sort of threads around answers, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Amy.
Hi, I'm Chris King, managing editor of the St. Louis American. This is kind of like church for me because our newspaper, we practice journalism, but it's in the service of community building. You can do the news and not go backwards on racial equity. The decision starts at the top. Our publisher is Donald M. Suggs, and people stay at our paper for a long time because it is mission-driven. If you want to build your community using journalism, come to the St. Louis American because that's what we do. And I'm getting lots of ideas from what you guys are saying, but mostly I'm just thinking, well, this is what we always do. We always elevate the ACLU or Arch City Defenders or the Deaconess Foundation because we look at the people that are doing the work and we elevate them. The people that are killing kids and leaving them on the streets, we don't tell their stories. Let that stay on the police scanner. Where it maybe belongs. And as for writing myself into the story, that's what editorials are for. So I'll write you an editorial coming out of this.
If I can jump in, kind of on this media question before we move from media to election administration. Our largest program at the Democracy Fund is about kind of the future of local journalism, and the way we have thought about it, right, is journalism is kind of under attack from two directions, right? One is the business model, right? How do you actually financially support a news operation? And then there's, the White House declaring the media to be the enemy of the people and, all of that jazz, right? And those two pressures combined are pretty pretty challenging. We tend to kind of look at how do you take kind of the crisis and look for the opportunity. And when you think about what is the future of journalism, what is the future of local journalism, on one hand, what you're trying to do is figure out how do you maintain the things that journalism's always been good at, right? Kind of the search for the truth, holding power to account, those kinds of things. But you also have to think about what has journalism historically not done a good job at, and how do you kind of use this opportunity to work on that? And there are some news organizations, especially kind of African-American owned newspapers historically, that haven't had this problem, but most news does a really poor job listening to people, right? They're good at telling you what you should care about. They're not great at listening to what you want to know more about. And I think as the business model has kind of fallen out of local journalism, in order for news organizations to survive and to thrive and to compete with Facebook and Twitter and Google, right? Facebook, Twitter, and Google will always know more about the public than news organizations will, right? They'll have better data to sell advertising because they know everything that we do, right? So if that's the case, the only way that media is going to survive is if it's able to create a business model that's not based on selling your eyeballs to advertiser. It's about earning your trust and being in community with you and serving your needs, right? And so how do we kind of redefine the business model of local journalism that prioritizes trust and community as opposed to solely focused on kind of truth and accountability, right? And I think there's an opportunity there that makes our democracy stronger if we do it right.
I just want to say how much I support nonprofit journalism, the PBS, and public broadcasting. When you think about Facebook and Twitter, social media, there's a concept called surveillance capitalism. And many of these companies are not based on a model of gaining profit from advertising anymore. And pretty soon that model, I believe, will be extinct. And I think most of the major media outlets have sensed that, and that's why they've begun charging for content online, from the New York Times to the Atlantic Monthly, Washington Post. So I do hope that there is some way that we can find an alternative model out before media organizations adopt surveillance capitalism themselves. When I say surveillance capitalism, what I mean is some of these companies are tracking your data and selling that metadata to others and making their profits through the selling of your data as opposed to just selling to advertisers. So in other words, in lieu of that, I hope philanthropy continues to support non-for-profit news sources. But in the meantime, I do hope there's another model that does soon emerge so that media companies do not engage in surveillance capitalism in the same way that the Twitter and the Facebooks of the world do. And the last plug I'll put on that, there's a controversy as to whether Facebook is a publisher or whether Twitter is a publisher in the sense that they should be regulated as such. I do believe that as a legal matter, they should be categorized as that.
Good deal. Thank you. Councilwoman Days, the mic is right behind you. Morning.
Well, election administration is extremely, I'm Richard Hurd Days, County Councilwoman from the 1st District, and former Director of Elections, Democratic Director of Elections in St. Louis County. Administration of elections is difficult at best, and I say that simply because you're dealing with people. And anytime you're dealing with people, there's a variety of issues that they bring to the table when you're dealing with different people. We come into the office has to be 50-50 partisan, Democrat, Republican. Okay, you say that, leave your partisanship at the door. It really doesn't happen. You know, they bring it in there with them. So when you look at how the polling locations are distributed, you look at the voter registrations and groups that decide that they want to go out and do voter registrations, and sometimes those registrations get processed in a timely manner, and sometimes they don't. Again, you're dealing with people with agendas. People have different ideas about how this thing should work. And so as you move forward looking at those kinds of things, you move next to the actual election day. I remember when Obama was elected the first time, people were standing in line till midnight to vote in that presidential election. Now, seldom if ever do you have, and that was basically in the African American community. You seldom if ever had those kinds of lines, that kind of backlog in the Caucasian community. It just didn't happen that way. We had smaller locations. We had smaller buildings in your African American community. And all these things contribute to why people don't want to come out. People don't have time to stand in line for 3 hours waiting to vote. Well, they did that time. They stayed to midnight to vote, and we saw the results of that. So. But it is indeed just a quagmire of issues that come up. We have now, do we show a photo ID? Do we not show a photo ID? We moved from the city to the county. I have to re-register. We have a statewide database. Why is that? So there are a lot of policies that put in place that prohibit us from just moving forward and doing what we can do for the people who want to come out and vote. So I think that when we look at all of these issues, it goes into the trust factor. And you look at, I'm standing here, I'm trying to, and I get to the polling location, and then they tell me I'm registered someplace else. People leave their jobs, some of them get 2 hours, some of them don't. I will tell you that. They do not get that. And so they have to go back to work. There's a vote lost. And so there's no way to recapture that. I don't know if anyone has, and probably you have seen the documentary Rigged. And it's systematic. It's systematic in how the gerrymandering has worked. It's systematic in how people are removed from the rolls. It is systematic in how people are discouraged from coming out to vote. So it is incumbent upon all of us, in whatever field we are, in whatever area we are, to make that happen. And I will say that the last thing, we have to engage our young people in this process. And we have to start on the elementary level. When your children come home 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 years old, and say, Mama, did you vote? That's your compass set right there. And so they voted in school, and so they come home and ask parents, have you done that? And I've sat on the post where, my kid came home and worried me until I came up here, until I voted. So that's a good thing. But we don't need to discard that as a method of getting people involved in this process. So from the administration perspective, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rita. That's fantastic. I always said that elections are a miracle. Right, if you think about it, because the process is so complicated. As Joe said, it's it's one day. If you think about it as a business, all your customers could show up on one day. And they expect everything to be perfect. They want to be in and out in 10 minutes. The average age of the essentially volunteer that's running this for you is 72 in Missouri. There's all this new technology. If the experience is bad, people are like, oh my gosh, it's rigged, right? There's a difference between competence and an intentional problem, but often that gets conflated. And then we all want the results in like 30 minutes after the polls close, right? So part of it about elections is setting expectations, and part of it is about helping the process that we can all recognize as complicated, but most people think ought to just work, for all of us to take some responsibility in that, right? And that means double checking your registration, talking to your folks in your communities about doing that, making sure that there are rides to the polls, volunteering and helping be election judges. So there are things we can do to help the process, and we all ought to take responsibility for that. I will also say that there are lots of institutional things that need to be changed, and we should be advocating for those, and whether that's automatic voter registration or whether that's, we're one of the few states in the country where you only have one day to vote, or your alternative is to lie, right? When you fill out that absentee form to say you're going to be out of town. And it's not particularly equitable, if you ask me, that a voter in some other state has 14 days to vote or can vote by mail at any time they want, and yet in our state, you have to either show up on one day on a Tuesday, which is crazy, or lie, right? So those are things that we should also be focused on, and I think we'll have a ballot measure that's going to let us talk about some of those things this year, so we should be advocating for that. I want to go back to your earlier question, if I can, for a second, which is what gives you tension and reflection, and I would say every single thing they said gave me tension and reflection. But my inspiration, I think, is one that in some ways I feel right here in St. Louis, which is post-Ferguson. Like, people do things and spend their time with things when they're going to get a result, right? When there's a connection of the action to a result. Otherwise, you got something else to do with your life. And one of the things that was so inspiring in Ferguson was that there was this very clear connection. Laws changed, judicial systems changed, judges changed, prosecutors changed, cops changed, officials changed. And so what we need to be doing is telling those stories, because that's what inspires people to be active, is to connect the activism to change. And one of the problems fundamentally with our election system, I think, and with the rise of all this technology, is the feedback loop, right, on our expectation of change has speeded up a lot, right? So that we get pretty fed up when we're used to being able to look at stuff immediately and either people like it or don't like it and we move on. Like, we got to wait 2 years or 4 years to be able to, like, get my voice out there to have change. So one of the other things that I'm a big advocate about is how we use other ways to bring voices in during the governing period. And whether that's about participatory budgeting or whether that's about other ways to get input. You mentioned the online petition thing that Obama did, but there are lots of experiments happening around the country and around the world on that. And we're in a place where we've seen the connection with activism and change. Now it's our job to do other things, right, beyond the crisis to connect that in voters' minds. So thank you all for being here. It's really great. That inspires me too.
So I want to make a shift and also note that as difficult as Rita and Robin note that it is, with appreciation, that it's more than electioneering. Mike Jones, who was here with us earlier, would say, you know, electioneering is something you do in order to get to govern. That it is not the entire democratic process. But even hearing how hard the administration of elections is, there's someone who still wants to do it. Our current director of St. Louis County election is here. Eric, I want to say this wrong. Fee or Faye? Just like Tina. I'm sorry? Just like Tina. Just like Tina. Faye. There you go. So that being said, add Eric to your prayer list as you hear all that we're discussing today. I want us to spend some time. So I'm sorry, I'm a recovering pastor. I haven't had yet a year out of this thing. I saw a survey the other day about the four phrases that you're tired of hearing from your pastor. The number one on the survey is turn to your neighbor. But I haven't had to say it for a while, so turn to your neighbor. I do want us to spend some time really with the accountability of a conversation with one other person around us. So either a dyad, so find one person, or find two people so that you can speak, the three of you together, on the question of what your organization is doing. Joe has charged us. He flew all the way in from D.C. to suggest to us that the next 12 months will be critical for democracy, and we need to do something. The next 12 months will be critical for democracy in this country, for the future of democracy in this country, and we need to do something. So I want to ask you to speak with your neighbors about what your organization is doing or what it could do to strengthen democratic access and engagement from now through 2020. What is your organization doing, or what could it do over the next 12 months to strengthen democratic engagement and access? So I invite you to spend some time having that conversation. Becky already let somebody cheat. She shared some of her answers. So have some conversation. I'd love to hear, we've got 2 more quick moves we're going to make. And they're both about getting to action. So I know you all are really excited about what you're hearing from your colleagues and your friends and the accountability that you're sharing by saying what you're going to do. We want to center 2 quick moves of accountability. One, we want to hear maybe 3 ideas that people have either come up with or you heard from your neighbor about what they're going to do in the next 12 months so that we can just lift those things out loud and maybe spur inspiration for our own activity in our organization. So we want to do that. Number 2, we've got this sense of accountability of our own. We want to share and introduce you to some partners that Deaconess will be working with and supporting for the next 12 months. As we seek to advance democracy in this community, share with you who they are with our support, and have them have an opportunity to share what they're going to be doing and invite you to support them. So first, let's get 3 things quickly that you either heard or that your organization is going to do. So 3 folks. You don't have to share 3 things. You can be one person and share 1 thing. So we can hear 3 different people. All right, Jess is excited up here. She passed earlier, so she's taking it up now. Go ahead.
I'm the founder and the executive director of the St. Louis Area Diaper Bank. And for the past couple of years, we've been really engaged at the state level in some advocacy efforts and have experienced some pretty significant wins at the state level. And I think just hearing Robin talk about that, it builds a sense of efficacy when folks can hear stories about when you do a thing, there is a result afterwards. And so I think, you know, Richard's question, which was mine as well, where do nonprofits fit into these conversations, especially when our boards and our donors are saying like, our mission is diapers, like it's not about voting, right? But that we really do have an opportunity to tell stories that demonstrate efficacy in the political process. So like, hey, look, our supporters have had these conversations with legislators, and when we are able to tell our stories, we can and do see change and see results. And so to kind of lift those stories up as a place that we're in a position to do something.
Great. Storytelling from our clients. You got it.
Hi, I'm Ellen Alper. I'm the CEO of the National Council of Jewish Women. And I heard something today that I think we should have been doing for the past 125 years that we've been around, and we haven't been. And I'm going to make sure every single one of my employees takes off to go vote and to work the polls, and I'm going to give them time to do that. And I think every one of us, if we really truly believe in this process, we need to tell all the folks that work for us, take the day off, go work the polls, and I'm going to pay you your regular salary, and you're just going to have PTO for that day. So we're going to do that. We are also doing a broad Protect the Vote, Promote the Vote program. We've got volunteers that are working to help people with absentee ballots, drivers to the polls, all kinds of things, because you're right, the democracy is under attack, and we need to protect it, and we as organizations, as a not-for-profit, need to do everything we can to do that. So thank you both for being here this morning.
Good deal. Thank you. We'll get Halbert. And then we'll get somebody on this side, just because I want to be somebody. All right, I see you, Mike.
Albert Sullivan, founder and president of the Father Support Center. You stole my thunder. Thank you. The polling piece was one of the things, the first things that allow staff time off for polling. But another thought, polling and voting. Another thought came to my mind. We have programs with youth, ages 14 to 24. And we don't do a good job of educating. When Rita mentioned elementary, I came to my mind and says, we got to start doing a better job with elementary, with educating on the vote.
Good deal. Thank you. Reverend Mike Addy, you get the last word.
My name is Michael Addy. I am the Executive Director of United Congregations of Metro East on the Illinois side. And one of the things that we are employing in our organization, we're part of the Gamaliel Network, is how do we integrate voter engagement in not only just every 4 years or during the election cycle, but every one of our campaigns has a piece of IVE attached to it, so that we are engaging voters on a continuous basis and moving them through what we call the tornado and moving them down from just passive voters to activist voters, therefore building our base. So one of the things that we promote throughout our network, and we've been in the process, and DeMarco's part of our network also, MCU, have been developing trainings for our affiliates and for community organizers to understand the tool of IVE and how making sure that it's just not a tool.
IVE means?
Oh, integrated voter engagement. Thank you. How we use IVE is not just every 4 years where we go out and knock doors, but how do we use it to have deeper conversations with voters at their doors throughout the years between those 4 years, and therefore build the base, and therefore change the dynamic of communities' engagement.
Thank you, Mike. So part of why we have these conversations is indeed to bring additional thinking, but really just to stir the remarkable thought among leaders in this community. And I think we owe a great debt of appreciation and gratitude to Joe and to Justin for bringing their work here to us and inspiring some of the things that have already been articulated. So please join me in thanking them.